Welcome, everybody, to our third book club conversation. We are featuring for April this book, Nicholas Black Elk, Medicine Man, Catechist Saint by Jon Sweeney, who's joining Claudia and myself today for a conversation. We focused last month on Embodied Spirits, Stories of Spiritual Directors of Color, edited by Therese Taylor Stinson, and we've really been enjoying the conversation that's been going on around that. And so we're going to transition this month to a historical figure. We've been working the last couple of months with contemporary writers of color. So we'll be exploring Nicholas Black Elk as someone more from that kind of communion of saints and cloud of witnesses. So I want to introduce Jon Sweeney. He is the publisher and editor-in-chief at Paraclete Press, and Claudia and I have both had the pleasure of working with him in that capacity. But he's also the author of many books on spirituality and history, biography, memoir, and a whole series of children's books about the Pope's cat named Margaret. And he works with a wonderful illustrator who's also a good friend of mine, who's a Benedictine oblate named Roy de Leon. So I love the small world of of Christian writing and all of this good stuff. So anyway, and one of his more frequent subjects would be Francis of Assisi. But in this case, he is sort of taking a different departure and exploring Black Elk as a mystic and a saint. So welcome, Jon. If you would tell us a little bit more about yourself and the kind of work you do and maybe where you are in the world.
Sure, and it is great to be with you, Claudia and Christine. And I had no idea that you were, or I forgot. I often now realize I need to say not that I didn't know, but that I forgot that you were a good friend of Roy de Leon, who is someone who I adore and I never get a chance to see, whether it's COVID or not. So anyway, that's nice to hear. I'm coming from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I live with my wife and my two daughters. I have 4 kids, ages 9 to 28, and 2 of them are at home. Well, not at the moment, but 2 of them are at home. One is 9 years old going on 10, and one is 18 going on 19. They're both in school still. The older one is about to finish high school. And we're about to move deeper into the city of Milwaukee, in part because that elder child is graduating high school, and we feel a little bit of freedom to move at that time and get involved in the city a little bit more deeply. My wife is a rabbi here, which is why we live in Milwaukee. We like Milwaukee, but that's why we moved to Milwaukee, because she is a progressive, or in the UK you would call liberal, rabbi. Her movement is Reconstructionist, if that means anything to anyone. Mm-hmm. And so I have an interesting religious life where I'm a member of a synagogue and a clergy spouse, but I am rabbi spouse, but I'm also a practicing Catholic. So it makes life rich and confusing sometimes.
It also seems like a great entry point for exploring the topic of your book, who sort of straddled different worlds as well. So maybe you could just tell us what inspired you to write this book in the first place. What was the launching place for getting you interested in Black Elk's story?
Yeah, I'll be honest. That is the simplest question, but it is always the most difficult question for me to answer. I've written a lot of other books, and that is a question that people always ask, as you know, because both of you write books. And I never have a good answer. I don't know if most authors have a good answer for that question, but I never do. Because usually I write about something because for years it's been percolating inside of me. Mm-hmm. Or because something happened a long time ago and I couldn't even identify exactly what it is, but it started a little flame inside of me. So, it's really that's the honest answer usually to why I write a book. In this case, I wrote it because I was to be sort of practical in my answer. I was asked to write 2 biographies in the series, of which this book is a part, called The People of God, published by Liturgical Press. Mm-hmm. And the first one I wrote was on Father James Martin, the popular Jesuit priest in the US. And that came out exactly a year before this one. but I was asked to do both sort of at the same time. So that's one sort of practical answer. But a more personal and meaningful answer, I think, is that I had a long-standing interest in Black Elk ever since I read Black Elk Speaks in college. I'm sure it was in college when I read it. And it didn't become much more than an interest in it, an interest that led me to read other books and led me to study a little bit and led me to take a couple of trips to the Black Hills. But then when the cause for canonization got underway, when I began to hear about how that was starting to happen in the Diocese of Rapid City, I was immediately really interested. And I don't know why, I just was deeply, very interested, wanted to sort of put myself right into the middle of it. And then usually the way that I begin to understand something and reflect about it is that I write. Mm-hmm. So I proposed to America Magazine, which is one of the couple of magazines that I write for semi-regularly, 4 years ago, that I do an article for them. And they were all over it. They said, absolutely, and here's a budget. We'll even send you to the Black Hills and you can go and interview the bishop and other people and so on. And that was terrific. Then for a variety of reasons, I ended up having a co-author on the article because I met a PhD in Black Elk and we became good friends. And I said, you really should write this thing with me because you know all this already. So the two of us, Damian Costello and I, ended up writing this article for America Magazine. It was viewed by a lot of people. It was terrifically fun to write and educational and inspiring. I think the life of Nicholas Black Elk is inspiring. And so then that led to writing the book in the series. And I actually was originally supposed to write it with Damian, my friend, mm-hmm. Damian Costello, but he was one of the postulators for the cause of canonization, which is, sort of the language that is used. And so he actually was too busy to write the book with me. He was too busy traveling all over the place and giving talks about Nicholas Black Elk. So he ended up being graceful and reviewing the manuscript and making sure that I didn't screw up or anything, but I wrote it by myself.
It's very handy to have a backup.
Yeah.
Someone to prove things. Yeah. Lovely.
So Jon, you mentioned in the book that all writers have an agenda. What was your agenda in writing this book?
Well, the most truthful answer to a question like that is to say that I don't know what some of my agenda is. I think it's almost more for the critic or the reader to decide what my agenda was. I did get a note early on from a conservative Catholic priest who told me exactly what he thought my agenda was.
What was that? What did he
say? No, I'm not going to get into that.
So I take it that this was not positive.
No, I mean, he told me my agenda was, every progressive cause that could be named, because I am aligned with a few of those. Like I mentioned, I wrote the biography of Father James Martin. So anyway, he's a bit of a lightning rod for progressive causes, and I am proud to align myself with him. But anyway, I guess aside from the subconscious agenda items that you can decide are there in the text that I wrote, I would say that I was drawn to the story of conversion, because I am always interested in conversion. Mm. I have a very complicated sort of religious life myself, a life of double identity, double belonging in some ways, but in some ways not. And we could get into that later. There's ways in which I sort of disavow that I'm double identified, but other ways in which it would be silly to say that I'm not, involved in two communities. But I'm very interested in conversion, generally speaking, as well, because it's part of my own path. I became a Catholic in 2009, and before I did, I actually wrote a book in which I talked about how conversion was so 20th century and it didn't really matter anymore. I said it more articulately than that, I think, but it was a book called Almost Catholic, in which I basically argued that, you know, I was almost Catholic and that we lived in an era when conversion doesn't mean what it used to mean anyway. And so can't we all just move on? But then a couple of years later, I converted and became a Catholic. So I have a complicated history and all that myself. So I found, and I continue to find, Nicholas Black Elk's the trajectory of his life and the complicatedness of his conversion to the Catholic Church intriguing at the least, and probably more than that as well. So that's probably the biggest for me. I go out of my way to say in the book that I don't for a minute pretend as if I'm going to be an expert on Native spiritual practice. Not a book about Native spiritual practice, and this is not a place to come to pick up some interesting tidbit about kinds of dancing or kinds of prayer that you might incorporate into your own Christian or otherwise practice to make it more intriguing. Because I find some of those ways in which we too easily accommodate the tradition of another into your own as troubling as well. So, I mean, I kind of have all that sort of baggage, you might call it, that I bring to it, but that's also why I find the story so intriguing.
Yeah. I wonder if you could, for maybe readers who haven't read the book yet, give them just a little snapshot or sketch of Nicholas Black Elk's life, and particularly the context, because, you know, the time that he lived in obviously was pretty problematic and troubling for him and his people.
Yeah, well, and this is really what's probably most interesting for the majority of readers, is the way in which Black Elk's life, the trajectory of it, but the context of it, the bigger context of it, of all sorts of things. I mean, of immigration, of evolution, of land grabbing, of discovering gold, of economic depression, of railroads, broken treaties, and charismatic figures. And I mean, it's there's a reason why there's been Hollywood movies made about these things, because there are big stories to tell. So Black Elk was born, most likely born in 1866 in what is now Wyoming, but was then simply a Lakota territory. It's right where Montana and Wyoming today come together at right angles. And one thing that we haven't mentioned yet is that I could have mentioned this as one of my reasons for writing the book and my agenda to answer Claudia's question, which is that I wanted to correct a little bit of what Black Elk Speaks leaves so untold and vague and misleading. And I'm not the first to do that. It's not like I've broken ground by doing that. Others have done it as well. But a book, the Black Elk Speaks is the best-selling book of or by a Native American figure of all time, millions and millions of copies. And so you almost can't stop correcting it because it is pervasive. And the primary thing to correct is that you would never know that Black Elk became Nicholas Black Elk, converted to Catholicism, and then spent 40 years as a catechist. You would never have any context for understanding why he would ever have a cause for canonization in the Roman Catholic Church if you only read Black Elk Speaks. So anyway, the reason I just thought to say that is because most of us tend to think that Black Elk was born on December 1st of 1866, but Jon Neihardt, who wrote Black Elk Speaks, either as told to Jon Neihardt or, I mean, that's originally the book was written as if it was by Black Elk, and then it's as told to Jon Neihardt, and then it actually is by Jon Neihardt. He decided that Black Elk was born on December 6th. And so that's what people who have read his book tend to think. But that's because he didn't understand the religious context of Black Elk's life, because Black Elk was baptized on December 6th, not in 1866, right, but long after. And that's how he took the name Nicholas, because as many people will know, December 6th is the feast day of St. Nicholas of Myra. And so he took the baptismal name of Nicholas. But anyway, that's when he came into the world. But he came into the world at a very complicated time that was full of immigration, whites, Euro-American settlers beginning to explore and claim native lands That, of course, had been going on for centuries before. And, we, meaning whites, Euro-American settlers, and those who come from those folks, were pushing indigenous people west, progressively pushing them west. And one of the reasons we was because of what they believed about God and manifest destiny, which perhaps people remember from social studies in high school. I mean, the idea that it's sort of a Christian responsibility to settle the West, to convert the West. I mean, Puritans and others in those days would look back to that verse about be fruitful and multiply and take it to mean that it justifies moving west and redeeming, so-called redeeming, converting and redeeming the people of the West and the culture of the West, and turning it into something that's in their own image. So that was all going on. And then Charles Darwin was Origin of Species and what became sort of the doctrines of evolution. Even though Christians were opposing them at that time, those ideas nevertheless sort of emboldened the already latent ideas that people had about Native people as savages, supported the belief that progress had to follow in all aspects of life, and that meant that simple things needed to become adaptable and more complicated things. And so, in other words, it was justification for destroying indigenous ways of life because civilization had to take over, and all of that worked together. And then land grabs and treaties that were broken, and economic depression. There were a couple of very serious economic depressions that were going on in the mid 19th century. One of them was just 3 years after Black Elk was born, made things even worse. And then at exactly that same time is when the first railroad was crossing the continent. Charismatic figures like Lieutenant Colonel Custer, who died at the Battle of Little Bighorn, another complicated figure, not simply just the sort of bad guy that he has become in history, but nonetheless a complicated figure that Black Elk was there at the Battle of Little Bighorn. So all of those factors are part of the sort of big story, the destruction of native life, the development of the West by whites who taking lands from indigenous people, and all those religious concepts as well as other ideas that factor into what justified it in the minds of people.
Yeah. It's really a heartbreaking story. And yeah. I mean, it's like a history that I sort of knew, but I think reading your description of it made it very accessible and real and unsettling, and yeah, all of those things.
Well, I'm glad it's unsettling because, and again, this goes to Claudia's question about what's my agenda. I wanted it to be unsettling, I told it in a way that did not hide the fact that I find it unsettling. There are other ways to tell it. You can always tell it differently. And I did not mask the fact that I think that we stole their land and that it was awful at every turn. At the same time, like I said about Custer, there are reasons occasionally to point out the complexity of human character, because I don't think we're all good and we're all bad. So, for instance, I remember that when I talk about Custer, he was a charismatic, interesting guy. He had this long, flowing, golden hair. He was sort of a rock star of his age. He was like a movie star. If there would have been Hollywood at that time, he would have been in it. But he led the 7th Cavalry, which is the military unit that basically went all the way across the Black Hills and continued to destroy Lakota life, and then was defeated at the Battle of Little Bighorn by Lakota, by Crazy Horse, and Black Elk was there. And Black Elk actually killed a few people that day. But anyway, Custer, just 3 years earlier, was in the Midwest and battling the Ku Klux Klan with the 7th Cavalry. So, he did some good things too. And then he went to Chicago and took a bow and got applause from everybody and wrote a book and And that's what, and actually in the book he wrote, he doesn't say the sort of terrible, awful things about indigenous people that you might think. He wasn't just setting out to destroy them. It was part of this context of this manifest destiny. It's just, this is the way of progress. This is the way it's going to have to be. It's a little bit tragic, but we all have to kind of move along and become a more complex civilization in order to live into the future. That was kind of the way.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I think it'd be interesting to maybe then explore a bit from this background and all these terrible things that have happened to him and his people. Then how does the door open? I mean, I know that obviously the missionaries were coming in to try and convert the native peoples, but how does that actually happen? Or do we have insight into that process, or what do we know about how that door opened?
Which process
of converting to Christianity and to Catholicism?
Oh, well, with settlers, I mean, going back to soon after Columbus, right around early 1500s, the missionaries were following right on the heels of explorers, as they were called, of course, or fur trappers. The French, the Spanish, the English were all coming to this continent from all angles, up from what is now Mexico and down from what is now Canada, and then across what is now the United States, pushing native people further and further to the west. I mentioned broken treaties, of course, because a lot of these treaties were progressively agreeing to coexistence with a native tribe or with a whole slew of native groups in exchange for them being accommodating of this westward expansion. And then the treaty would be broken and the expansion would become more aggressive. In fact, one thing that was often fueling that was gold. Discovery of gold at Pikes Peak in the 1860s, the discovery of gold in California in the 1850s. Every time there was a little nugget of gold that someone found in a river, thousands upon thousands of people in their wagons went right across the Black Hills of Black Elk on their way to California or Montana or wherever they were going to go search for their riches. So there really were these sort of unstoppable forces. It's hard to not tell the story with an inevitability to it. But the missionaries were there really from the beginning. There were good ones and there were bad ones. The bad ones took the view that Columbus talked about. I mean, all the way back to Columbus in his journal when he was doing his initial trip in 1492, wrote about meeting indigenous people and how credulous they were. They would just easily believe anything that we told them. I mean, he was awful. I was talking about how Custer was a complex figure and wasn't all good and all bad. It's hard not to see Columbus as all bad when you read. But it was just widely believed that unless a people were Christian, they were unfit to inhabit the New World. I mean, that was the way it was looked upon. And there were a lot of missionaries that took that approach. And that's why we have these, I'm sorry to be depressing here, but that's why we have more terrible stories about the deliberate destruction of native customs and native religion and practices, mandatory cutting their hair, mandatory going to a school and sitting behind a little desk and using books. I mean, native people educated one another, educated their children, but it was a different way. It was a different worldview. It wasn't in a little schoolhouse sitting behind a desk having to cut your hair. So it was a deliberate Europeanizing of native people. And then that became something that became a way of life too, not just an education, but then they were required to farm plots of land. because again, they had to live like Europeans. They had to unlearn a nomadic lifestyle because that was too unpredictable for the whites, and they had to do it the European way. So, I mean, the missionaries often were reinforcing in negative ways, what we would certainly call today damaging negative ways, those kinds of practices. But there were some exceptions. And one of those, which I do get into a little bit in the book, I don't remember what chapter, but I talk about how the Jesuits, the reason why the Jesuits seemed to develop really warm relationships on the whole in the Black Hills and became the mentors of Nicholas Black Elk was because they were able to see Lakota practice, indigenous religious practice, as not contradictory to their own Christianity. So they were able to see the words that they use for Great Spirit, and they would say, that's God. We don't need to tell them that they're pagans. They already have an understanding of God. And they were able to sort of understand, put themselves into the life as opposed to standing outside of it, and put themselves into the language even, and help translate the language for Lakota people for the first time. And it was that kind of an environment that I think made it feel like it wasn't quite so violent to convert for someone like Black Elk to convert to Catholicism, which didn't have to mean a turning away from Lakota spiritual practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Claudia, you had some interesting questions, I know, to ponder. And you're on mute though, so.
There were some sirens, so.
Oh, gotcha.
One of the questions that I wanted to know, Jon, is if you got any pushback for challenging the book Black Elk Speaks, which is so widely popular.
No, I really haven't. And there's probably a couple of reasons for that. One is, as I said before, it's not as if this is the first time it's been done. I'm not making a claim to original scholarship here. But the other reason is, I guess I suspect that anyone who would pick up this book, Nicholas Black Elk, with the descriptive copy for it and so on, would probably be predisposed to see the bigger picture anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, frankly, I wouldn't mind so much if those thousands of college students would read my book instead of Black Elk Speaks, but I think they're probably going to still read Black Elk Speaks. And it's not terrible that they do that. I mean, Black Elk Speaks, there are some scholars of Black Elk who will sort of completely disavow Black Elk Speaks because they want you to read what Black Elk had to say through the words of other writers and other scholars that don't have the overlay of John Neihardt, because we do think that John Neihardt had too much of an agenda, to go back to an agenda, and it comes through so clearly in some of the ways that we've already talked about. But no, I have not gotten any letters or any emails or obnoxious tweets telling me that I am being unfair to John Neihardt. I wish I would, actually. It would mean that maybe those with my book.
I think Claudia and I have to start a little secret campaign.
Okay, so another question that I have, Jon. A lot of talk is going around in the writers community about whose story is yours to tell. And this, is especially relating to BIPOC people. Should a indigenous person have written this book? Was this your story to tell? And if it was, why? And if you feel at this point that it was not, or at any point that it was not your story to tell, why?
I think the best answer I have, there's so many answers to that question, and you may have a different one than I do. My best answer is to say, at this point in time, in 2021 or in 2020, when I was writing this book, because I'm sure I would have written this book differently had I done it 10 years ago. or 10 years from now. We are always living in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
I feel that in the moment that I wrote this book, and I still feel that I'm in that moment, it is my job to tell any story about history, because I do tell a lot of historical stories, and that's a lot of my writing, is to write about figures in the past in a way that is truthful beyond white, in this case, Euro-American experience. There would have been a way to write this book that would have been wrong, and that would have been improper, perhaps, in the way that you're getting at in your question. Was it my story to tell? I have no idea if it was my story to tell. I feel like that's for other people to decide, but I do believe that it was my story to tell correctly. It was my story to tell from my perspective as a white person, to tell the story of expansion, of missionary activity, of conversion, of life in the Black Hills, of conflict between whites and Native folks, because I get into a little bit of Indigenous life today and what all of this means. It was my job to tell all of that story in a way that was as best I could do, that would have a world that was fully inclusive and understanding of the perspectives of people who aren't white, and in this case, of people who are Lakota and Indigenous. That's like the best I could do.
I think you did a masterful job, by the way. That came through completely, and I really appreciated that as a person of color.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I wonder if we can explore a little bit about what we talked about at the beginning, this idea of double identity, double belonging, multiple spiritual identities. What does Nicholas Black Elk have to teach us about this from your perspective? And I think particularly like in this day and age where I think that multiplicity of spiritual identity is becoming more and more the norm for a lot of people.
That's interesting. That last comment you just made, I hadn't thought about that. Is that true? Is it becoming the norm?
Well, I have to say I'm not basing that on social science research. I guess what I think, maybe what I'm thinking is that more and more people throughout their span of their lives are exploring different spiritual traditions more so, I would think, than they would have in the past. That's because it's becoming more of a, so maybe not multiple identities at the same time, but I think people tend to kind of pick and choose as they go along, and what works for them, and because we have this kind of cornucopia of possibilities available to us.
Well, as a way of getting into answering that question, let me say a couple more personal things.
Yeah.
Yeah. That I've worked in books and in publishing my whole adult life. And one of the things that I did a long time ago now, 20 plus years ago, is I founded a publishing house called Skylight Paths Publishing in Vermont. And it was founded as a multi-faith publishing enterprise. And our goal from the beginning was not to blend traditions. And we went to great pains to articulate this because, people's attention spans are very short and they won't remember. They won't remember how to distinguish us from what others are doing. But we were constantly trying to say that we're not looking to blend religious traditions. We're not telling people to, put all the traditions up in the air and then just pluck down whatever seems coziest for you at the moment. But instead, we were trying to bring the traditions into conversation in a way that is meaningful. And what I mean by that is, I've always sort of decried the word dialogue. I hate the word dialogue. In the religious context, I know it's like the great word, dialogue. But to me, the word dialogue is a word that's like a professional word. Mm-hmm. If you in a diocesan office, or if you're the head of interfaith dialogue for the Presbyterian Church or whatever, then you love to go and sit at a table and do dialogue. But I mean, people like me and like you and people who are sitting at Mass, or people who are are going to church or who are at a hymn sing or whatever, they're not looking to do dialogue. They're just looking to talk. They just want to talk. They want to interact. They want to sit next to someone of a different tradition. They want to observe what they do. They want to ask questions. So I've had a passion for that kind of religious exchange.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first thing. The second thing is that fairly long after that publishing experience that I just described, I ended up, by chance or by providence or whatever, I ended up dating and marrying a rabbi. That wasn't my plan, but it's the way it worked. And I'm glad, and I'm still married to a rabbi. But at the same time, the same kind of distinctions come into play in my life, in my family.
Mm-hmm.
Just for example, her name is Michal. We wrote a book together several years ago now. Of course, it's out of print. And it's a book on marriage. What is it like for a Catholic to be married to a Jew? What is it like for an involved Catholic to be married to a rabbi?
Mm-hmm.
We say a variety of things in there, but for instance, we say that we made the decision. We're not saying that this is true for everybody, but we made the decision not to blend the traditions in our home.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, not to blend the traditions in the raising of our child. We have one child together. We have an adopted teenager who sort of came later, but we have a child together, and we are raising her Jewish. And I explain in the book from my perspective why I think it's fine to raise her Jewish, why I'm honored to be involved in raising a Jewish child. This almost goes back to Claudia's question about, was it my book to write? Is it my role to raise a Jewish child? I mean, it's almost the same kind of question.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's not to do the best I can in a way that is sensitive fully to the other tradition. So I guess what I'm saying is just so that readers know where I'm coming from personally, if they care, is that double identity is of great interest to me, but at the same time, I'm so hesitant about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I would never to be Jewish and Catholic both, never.
Yeah.
But if you were to ask the members of the synagogue of which I am a member and my wife is a rabbi of, they would probably say to you, to every person in the room, as Jewish as all of us, because he's here for everything. He does everything. He's present for everything, and he prays and he studies and prays in Hebrew, and so it's complicated. All these things are complicated.
Yeah.
Which reminds me of the last thing I'll say, which is sometimes when I give a talk in a church, I love to, like when I'm introduced, and they read the long introduction before you stand up. When you read my introduction that people take off the web, I often stand up and I'm kind of chuckling because I think I sound nuts, I'm a little bit of this and a little bit of this, and a little bit of this. And so I usually stand up and say something like, I want you to know that, religious pilgrimages and the spiritual life is really confusing, and it's convoluted, and it's not neat and tidy. Yeah. And if anyone wants to talk to me afterwards about that, I would love to talk with you. And I always have people who want to talk to me about that. It's almost like I think my mission in life, my role, my vocation is to communicate to people that it's okay for a religious life to be super complicated.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said about double identity, and I said this at the beginning, I was drawn to this in Black Elk. Mm-hmm. I think that there are, and this comes out in the book, I think pretty clearly, there are those even members of Black Elk's family who said his conversion was not real to Catholicism, that he only did it in order to get along in a white man's world. Mm-hmm. And it's not hard to imagine how to make that argument. I mean, it's not hard at all to imagine that would make a lot of sense. And when you get into the whole episode of when Black Elk joined Wild Bill Cody's Wild West show and traveled all over the country. And again, I think in the way I wrote that chapter, it would be easy to make that argument too, that he was just trying to get along and make a few bucks and out of the devastation of the Black Hills. And, but how could he do that? How could he go and, dress up like an indigenous person and dance for the white people? But anyway, we won't get into that. But there are those in his own family who have questioned it, and then there are those in his own family who have said it was absolutely a genuine conversion. And I think 40 years of life as a catechist is pretty good evidence, as well as all of the letters and he wrote letters like St. Paul to the early churches. Mm-hmm. letters to the communities throughout the Black Hills and beyond, encouraging converts and churches, and he preached, and he did funerals, and he was a masterful teacher of the scriptures, and he incorporated the life of the sacraments, which is what a Catholic's life is about, into his own life, which still included Native traditions. And so he was able to maintain those two identities. And that's something that people will disagree on when they talk about Black Elk, which is some people won't agree that it is okay to maintain that double identity, but not think that you're not fully there in one way or another, but instead to accept that Nicholas Black Elk was equally at home praying with his Lakota pipe and with his drum as he was in the Catholic sacramental life. Okay to be perfectly at home in both.
Yeah.
But in my experience, that's uncommon. In my experience, it's more of an either or, and I just expressed how in my own life there is a little bit of either or. And also in my experience, it's not so common to be double identified into traditions as it is to sort of throw everything up in the air and just decide I'll do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and I'm spiritual, not religious.
Yeah. I actually had a question about that, and you answered it, as you intended. I did find the book really uncomfortable at times. And there were times that I wanted him to not be Catholic. As Catholic as I am, I wanted him not to be Catholic. And it reminded me of, I don't know if you knew this, John, but the voodoo queen of New Orleans, Marie Laveau, was a devout Catholic. And somehow she was able to integrate both of these things in her life, and I would dare say maybe seamlessly. She's buried in consecrated ground, as a Catholic. And, I find this tremendous tension between who we are as people of color, where we came from, and trying to both embrace that, yet, well, I was telling Christine that I am really interested in African spirituality, but I am not African. I am African American. And largely, our spiritual tradition in America is Christian. So, yeah, I find this tremendous tension between what in Africa can I have, and now that I've done the DNA test, it's Nigerian. And so I know what Nigerian culture is like, but it's still not exactly my culture. And being an African American is not exactly my culture here either.
Yeah. I think I totally hear what you're saying. I have the same feeling as a Catholic watching Black Elk become one. And I would so the folks in the book club who are going to read this book, let's not give it away, but let me say, make sure, every one of you, that you pay attention to the part where Black Elk has his first pivotal, dramatic, actually violent encounter with a priest who throws him out of the teepee for doing his medicine man work. So anyway, just make sure that people take note of that. When you read that episode and you realize that that was the galvanizing moment when he became a Catholic, that's shocking. I mean, it's shocking. I mean, to me, actually, as someone who loves the saints and really believes what other people think is nonsense about the saints, to me, it actually is an indication of his saintliness right there. He wasn't even a Catholic yet, but the humility, I can't imagine the humility that it took to go from that episode, which we're not telling people about, to studying to become a Catholic and then very rapidly becoming one. But I would also back up just in as sort of a response to what you said, Claudia, to say that I think you have to look at the great vision of, and that's a like a proper noun, the great vision of Nicholas Black Elk, in order to, it's the only way that I can really understand what you're talking about, and which I have trouble understanding too, is you go back and you look at that episode, and there's a chapter on this in the book, when he's 9 years old and he has what is called the great vision. And it was expected that he would have a vision because he was from a line of medicine men, of holy men, and he needed to be initiated into the same practice, and it was understood that he would be when the time was right. Some people today would call it like a near-death experience. He's lying there. Everyone around him thinks that he's gone, and he's off having this great vision. And when he comes back, it's as if no time has passed. So, I mean, that's kind of the situation. But in this great vision, which he then carried throughout his life, so from the age of 9 all the way throughout his life, he basically, the conclusion of the vision, and it's full of architecture of all different layers and stuff. We don't need to get into all of that. But the whole purpose of the vision was to communicate to him that he had a mission to save his people. There's the flowering tree, and there's the sacred hoop, and there's all these images that he then carries throughout his life, the red road, and they all come from the great vision when he's 9. But how his people are going to be saved, it's not just one single simple little thing. It's not like it's just asking Jesus into your heart. I mean, it's complicated, and it's full of symbolism, and it's full of the culture where he came from and then where he was headed. So I think he then had this rich medicine man practice. And then when he added his Catholic life, the two were able to blend together. He was able to see that Jesus offered something that he needed desperately, but that didn't, he had to put his pipe away. So, yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to continue to sort of struggle with it too. It's not easy to grasp. And I do think that Christine was right, that there's going to be more of this in the future. I just hope, this is personal agenda. I just hope that people, as we go into the future, continue to do it as carefully and as thoughtfully as someone like Nicholas Black Elk did.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm noticing how we're getting to the end of our time, but I did want to touch on one more question, because part of the purpose of this book club group is to really expand our understanding of spiritual practice, Christian spiritual practice, and mysticism, and even sainthood. I guess the question I'm wondering is, like, what is the legacy that you think that Black Elk leaves as assuming he's canonized as a Christian saint, and maybe even like the particular charism that's kind of carried forward in that, or anything that you might have to say about what he would offer to our understanding of Christian mysticism.
No, I'll be honest, I haven't really thought much about it, so it's really going to be off the top of my head.
Yeah, great.
So, what's astonishing about Black Elk, what was astonishing about Black Elk to his contemporaries when he became a catechist, was his incredible ability to memorize the scripture and to internalize the scripture and its lessons in his life, and then sort of seamlessly and easily communicate them to others on the road.
Yeah.
That's what made him such a great catechist. And I know that there have been others, bishops and others, who have given talks about Nicholas Black Elk and have praised him as an example for catechists. So, I mean, I think there is that for sure. I talk about in the book that his great gift for that came from the oral culture that had raised him, which is completely lost, of course, today. I mean,
well, that whole idea of learning by heart, it's actually very strong in the Irish culture as well, and it really does, like, there's an inhabiting of the story that's so different from the traditional storytellers here than someone who proclaims the gospel at church from the book. and what
or just looking it up on our smartphones so we can remember that it says that somewhere in the Bible. I mean, that certainly was a gift of his and an example of his. But I think I would add that he had a great ability to see into things, which is something that Christian mystics have always figured out, to see into things, to to see, I mean, the reason why things like the flowering tree and the sacred hoop and the mountain experience and visions themselves played such a role in his life was because he was able to experience perhaps what, and I think this is true of saints, a lot of saints, they experience things that the rest of us also experience, but they understand them, they grasp them, they see into in a way that most of us don't.
Yeah.
I may have, when I walked my daughter to school this morning, perhaps I walked right past a flowering tree, you know, I mean, and I don't mean to trivialize it in that sense, but that is what I mean. This is one of the things I often say about St. Francis of Assisi is that when he preached to the birds, it's not just that he didn't like it that other people weren't listening to him, and so he happened to see some birds and he preached to them. It was so much deeper than that. It was that there was a kinship that he understood with these creatures. And the people around him must have thought that he was absolutely bonkers for feeling such a kinship. But how incredibly contemporary his perspective seems in the 21st century.
Yeah, absolutely.
So anyway, I think there is such a thoughtfulness, and this is part of why I don't mind Black Elk Speaks. It's a beautiful book still, because the way that he sees into things comes through clearly there. The mystic comes through clearly. I just wish that it was nuanced so that you knew that he was a Christian mystic that was coming through there.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for that, Jon. Well, as we bring things to a close, Claudia, is there anything else any other burning question before we bring the conversation to a close?
No, this was great, Jon. This was a great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate your willingness to share your passion for understanding people and breaking them open across time and space. And it's a beautiful book. So thank you for that.
Thanks very much. I'm delighted you chose it, and thanks for I get to see your faces.
Wonderful. Thank you.